my voice? Am I loud enough? Yes, okay, good. My name is Monika Molnar-Metzentin. I'm the Director of Engagement and Visitor Experience here at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Santa Barbara. And I'm very happy to see you all here tonight, and I see a lot of faces that I've never seen here at the museum, so that's even better. We are currently showing an artist from New York. She goes by the name of N Dash. It is an abstract artist. As you can see, there's very little subject matter. She is focusing on exploring her materials. And a very prominent material in her work is clay. You will see this on some pieces right on the surface, but you can also see it underneath all of these pieces. Every single piece here, with the exception of the works on paper, do have a foundation with clay. From there to thinking about natural pigments was not a very far step. In addition, she's also using graphite on some of her works. She has ventured off in more modern pigments these days. However, we really wanted to have a look at what is it that brings not only the paint but the color to a work, and where does it start, and why might something like this be so interesting for an artist like this. So we were thinking nature, Natural History Museum. The Natural History Museum said we have just the right person for you. That's how I got introduced to Bill. And I would like to introduce Bill to you now, although I think most of you know him probably way better than I do. His real name is William D. Hyder, and he's a retired UC Santa Cruz administrator, but he has Santa Barbara roots, as he received his MAs in Political Science and Anthropology from UC Santa Barbara. And he's also involved as a research associate at the Santa Barbara Museum of History. He's a past president of the American Rock Art Research Association and is currently a board member of the California Rock Art Foundation. In addition to numerous articles, presentations, and monographs, Bill is actively engaged in numismatic research, meaning he collects coins and knows a lot about coins. 3 books he co-edited received awards as the best books of the year, devoted to the study of tokens and medals. In his retirement, he remains involved in archaeology and numismatics as an independent researcher and through designing and producing publications. And I learned he just finished one project today. Tonight, we are looking forward to learning more about nature's palette, the pigments of the earth. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to start with a couple of caveats. I'm partially red-green colorblind, which makes it interesting for studying rock art, and particularly seeing very faint things. So if I say something about a color that seems off to you, live with it. That's what it looks like to me. Second, I'm not a pigment scientist. I've been studying rock art for 40 years, and it always amazes me to think back on it. 30 years ago, I was approached by a pigment scientist with the Getty Conservation Institute, and Georgia Lee, who's no longer with us, and I, over the years, had collected small chips of paintings that had fallen off rock art sites, and we collected them out of the sand before they disappeared, and we gave those to David, and then he worked with the Natural History Museum and John and the people there to sample paint cakes and other kinds of things, and then a variety of people took them into sites where they took pigment samples, and they did that with a needle. So you think about the paintings that they have at the Getty, they have to sample pigments when they're doing it. They have what's a needle that they just stick in the pigments, and there's enough that's on there. You can't see it. I watched the process, but it's enough for them to talk about pigments. And he was gracious enough to make me co-author of the study he did of Chumash pigments, but he's the one who wrote the paper. I added some of the ethnography and some of the stuff about the Chumash, but he was gracious enough to include me as an author. So I can go some distance, but there's a lot of questions I can't answer. But to start off with, living here in Santa Barbara, right up in San Marcos Pass, Chumash Painted Cave State Historic Park. And if you've never seen a rock art site, this site is significant enough that in archaeology, the rock art of this area is known as the Santa Barbara painted style. And it's known as the Santa Barbara painted style because of this cave. You can drive up and visit the cave. It's covered with a grate, so you can't go inside, but you get a nice clear view through the grate. And I encourage you, if you've never been there, to stop by and give a visit. In the cave, this is another picture from the back of the cave. The three main pigments that appear in Chumash rock art and most rock art around the world are red, white, and black. That's the primary color palette that's been used through time. And all three colors are here. And if you look carefully, because of the overpainting in Painted Cave, you can see kind of the progression of art through time, through some very simple line drawings to monochrome paintings to polychrome paintings. And if I had the opportunity to do some recording for State Park, and we're inside the cave with studio lights, and that drawing technique was the last technique that's used in Painted Cave. And you can't really see it from the outside, and when you're inside, if you don't know that it's there, you won't see it. When we turned on the studio lights, we went, oh wow, there's more here than we knew. And that's kind of the rule of studying rock art. No matter how much you know, you have something more to learn with more careful observation. And I will get to that towards the end of this. In preparing this talk, I learned things that I didn't know before that ended up important for some research that I'm doing now. But red is the most prominent pigment. It's the most prominent pigment in part because of preference of humans for the color red. It's kind of the color of life. That's why I wore a red shirt today. I think it's red. It's red to me. And in part because red pigment is an iron oxide, and it forms a bond with the rock substrate that's really hard to break. And so it can erode away, and you will still have that red stain of what was painted there. That's not necessarily true of other pigments that were used. And the painting that I'm showing here is out in the Carrizo Plain. That's far north of Santa Barbara, the northern extent of the Chumash culture. And this is known to the local farmers as the blessing. To give you an idea of scale, the body of that anthropomorph is about the size of your index finger. The width of those lines is like you dipped your finger in red paint and you drew that anthropomorph. But they also had very fine brushes and other kinds of techniques. So if you think of the lines as being the width of your finger tip, that sun has been painted with a very fine brush. And there are some seats up front with a very fine brush, so they had a variety of techniques that they used. And each time I show you something in the Chumash area, I'm just going to show you some other examples from around California. The figure on your left are red lines that are in the Pomo area, north of the Bay Area, again in the state park. And those are painted with a brush. The figure on the right is just outside of San Diego in an area called Rancho Bernardo, and this is called the Rancho Bernardo maze style, but none of these are mazes. They're just these complex geometric figures. This one is painted on granite. The figure has been enhanced because those figures today are almost gone. If you have good red color vision, you can see them. For me, I had to be pointed out where they were so I could then take the picture and come home and enhance it so I could actually see the paintings myself. And today, from the aerospace industry, we have a technique that's called de-stretch that allows us to take a photograph and do a transformation of the different color spaces and bring out different pigments. And just to give you an example of that, this is at Fremont site in Utah at Painted Rocks, again in a state park. The left-hand part of the picture is a regular shot from the camera, and you can kind of make out the figures that are there. The right-hand side, I've applied a de-stretch transformation to it to bring out the red, and then laid that level over the original photograph to make it look more like it would have appeared when it was painted. So these are some of the techniques that we have available to us today to help capture and restore visually, not on the rock, but restore visually paintings from centuries ago that today are very difficult to see. Red is a product of red ochre or hematite. Hematite is the base metal oxide. It's an iron oxide. In the crystalline form, it's hematite. In a form where it's in a clay and sand mixture, we call it ochre. The natural colors range from black, so the crystalline form often looks black, and you go, that's red hematite? And yes, that's what it is. And in clay forms, it runs from red to reddish brown. It's been used around the world from the earliest times in human history. It's been used for body painting. Some cultures have used it as a medicine, and almost everyone has used it in art. And when I say from the earliest human history, we have evidence, archaeological evidence of ochre mining in the Middle Stone Age in Africa. That's sites that date from 280,000 to 50,000 years ago. That's pretty long in the history of hominids and humans. In Blombus Cave in South Africa, in the excavations there, they found raw red ochre. They found grinding stones that were used to grind the pigment. They found pallets and shells used for pigment storage, and those date between 80,000 to 100,000 years ago. And that's good, solid evidence of humans mining ochre and processing it to make pigment. In the Paleolithic, you often find large red stains in sites, and they believe those came from people using red ochre as body paint. And when I say they painted their bodies in red ochre, it was to protect their skin from the sun. They often covered burials in red ochre, and there's some thought it may have helped with the odors that emanate from decomposition, or it may have been a ceremonial use. We don't really know. And then there are other kind of uses. And I put up a picture. It's not my picture. It's from a French archaeological site on Hyder Cave. That's a hand stencil with red ochre that's approximately 30,000 years old. The next most common pigment around here is black. Charcoal is the most common source. In the ethnography, we learned that they created boxes for fireboxes to gather soot on the roof of the box. That was probably used in body painting. So far there's no evidence it was used in rock art, and I'll explain that in a little bit. Campbell Grant, who wrote the rock paintings of the Chumash and was published through the Museum of Natural History back in 1965. He references finding a hydrous manganese oxide lump of paint, pigment. It was a formed lump, and it had X's in it, so this was something that was formed as a trade item or a sales item. The earliest use of charcoal in this area is for drawing directly onto the rock. And this is on San Antonio Creek, again in San Marcos Pass. I'm trying to use pictures right here from the local area to keep it real as we're in Santa Barbara. And these are charcoal lines that are drawn on the rock. There are some red lines in there that are very difficult to make out. So they were also using ochre as a crayon, but charcoal is the most common thing that we find. This is from Fern Cave in Lava Beds National Monument up on the California-Oregon border. And here the paintings are in black and white. And black is the more stable pigment in this picture, but you can see there's a very extensive wall covered with black and white paintings. And from back in the Chumash area, from Vandenberg Air Force Base, this is a site known as Swordfish Cave. That swordfish is painted in black over a red cartouche-like figure, and there's 2 white dots. And for those of you that are familiar with fish, and swordfish in particular, the swordfish is actually painted upside down. Whether that was a deliberate choice or that's just the way it was done, we don't know, but there's some belief that that was a deliberate choice. We don't have any tests that have manganese from the Santa Barbara area, but in the Paleolithic, that manganese was used as a black pigment. And this is the site of Peshmeral, very famous, the horse paintings. And when you look at this horse painting, I'm just going to step over here for a moment. If you see the horse head here, that's not the horse's head. The horse's head is right there. It's just painted on a rock that looks like a horse's head. But Michel Lord-Blanchet, who studied this cave, and I got a personal tour from him, so I learned a little bit more about it. He reproduced this panel in another cave that had no art in it, so it could be signed and marked as being a reproduction and not real prehistoric art. But the circles, the horse, and the hand are all produced by grinding up the manganese, chewing it up finer in the mouth and mixing it with your saliva, and then blowing out with a reed like an airbrush. And so if you think of the work that it took to do that. He also discovered something that was not known about black manganese. When you chew enough of it and you do a production like this, there are some hallucinogenic properties to manganese, and you do get high because you ingest some of it. It's really hard to avoid doing that. But as I said, all the samples that we have tested, that David Scott has tested, I shouldn't use the royal we for someone else's work, proved to be charcoal, not soot, but charcoal. And we know that. This is a scanning electron microscope image of the cross-section through the black pigment layer. And this cellular structure right here is the surviving cellular structure of the charcoal. If you had soot, you wouldn't have even minute pieces of the wood remaining in that charcoal. And so we know that all the blacks that have been tested are charcoal. The third most common, and the one that erodes away fastest, is white. This is from the Hurricane Deck area in our backcountry here. We know this is from Condor Cave. We know this is a condor, in part because the head is red. Condors' bodies are not white, but the wingtip feathers that form that V shape are indicative of the condors and are more or less unique to condors in this area. So we know that this is a condor. And while it's not relevant to a study of pigments, if you notice it's painted over a bear paw petroglyph. And that's a topic for another day. Chumash ethnography tells us that the Chumash burned shell, probably heavy clamshells. They burned them to make a white pigment. Now you wouldn't burn them and turn them black. You're burning them to break down the structure of the shell so it's easier to grind. Ethnography also tells us they use diatomaceous earth. And if you go up to the museum in Chumash Hall, you will see pieces of diatomaceous earth that have been used for painting. Elsewhere in California, they used a white clay. We can say without a doubt, all of the white pigment that's been tested has been shell. And we can say that, and there will be an exception, that's the next slide. We can say that because the calcium carbonate of the shell, when it's used as a pigment and painted on the rock, it's exposed to the external elements, and it undergoes a conversion to gypsum. Diatomaceous earth doesn't do that. So why is diatomaceous earth in the ethnography? Diatomaceous earth is used in body painting, and the Chumash still today use the diatomaceous earth that they get from Lompoc in body painting for ceremonial dances and other kind of events. But we know that diatomaceous earth in all the whites that we have tested has turned to gypsum, therefore it can't be diatomaceous earth. And we knew that it was burned shell because there is no ethnography of the Chumash using gypsum. And nobody's ever found gypsum in an archaeological context. Well, in 1935, the Santa Barbara Museum did a survey and collected remains from cache caves in the Hurricane Deck area. They got into there before it was heavily disturbed, but from the outside. And at one of the sites, it's in the lower left-hand corner. That shot's by a friend of mine, Tom Natow, who's here tonight. In the distance, there's some high rocks. As you get back there, they had to use ropes to climb up to the top of one of those rocks. And there were 3 cache caves in the top. Well, this piece of gypsum came out of that cave that was closest to you. And so in the edges of ground, when I was doing research on the 1935 expedition, looking at re-examining some of it, there was a record that they found selenite. That's what they called this rock. It's about this big. In one of the caves, I didn't think anything about it. And then I went up to actually examine the pieces. And John came out and he says, look at the edge of that. It's been ground. That might be white pigment. And so I had to research selenite. Selenite's gypsum. So now we have, I think David Scott would not have said that gypsum was not used in the area because now we have archaeological evidence of gypsum. And I had to sort of go learn that because I was preparing this talk. So this talk's been actually very useful to me. Here's a couple other examples. The painting on the left is from Porterville Rocky Hill. That's in the Yokuts territory. That's in a really cool cave. You have to lay down on your back and look up at the ceiling in order to see this painting. It's in red and white. The one on the right is from Yellow's Bluff. That's in Lava Beds National Monument, Modoc territory. And those are on a volcanic stone, and they're painted white and red. In addition to working around here, I've done a lot of work on basket maker rock art in Utah, and most of the paintings in that area are white. It's probably a white clay. This is a really nicely preserved example from the early Pueblo period, probably around 1200 AD. Just around the corner and down a little side canyon is a place called Green Mass. And it's filled with basket maker paintings. The figures on the left that have the cool headdresses are probably from around 300, 400 AD. The brighter white pigment is probably late basket maker, 750 to 900 AD. And you can see that the white doesn't survive very well. As I come in closer on and I'll have to point it out, there's a large basket maker figure here. Here's the shoulders, the head, it has an ear appendage coming off, it has necklaces. That's probably about 250 AD. This bird here on top of the smaller figure is about 500 to 600 years later, and you can see the difference in survival of the white pigment. On the right are two of those figures with the headdresses. The ones that were in the previous figure were male, and we know they were male because they had male appendages. And these are female. We know they're female because they have the red circles for the dots. But you can see these were once full figures with legs and feet, and the legs and feet are already gone in those paintings. But just to bring the red, black, and white back to the Chumash, this is from Burro Flats down in Ventura County, and this is an exquisite use. It's a well-protected cave of what was probably, is either, I should say, shouldn't say probably, is either a mythological figure or it's a representation of a ceremonial Chumash dancer. And we know that they had dance costumes. There's an example from the Central Valley that's now in a museum in Russia of a full condor skinned and made into a full cape with the wings coming around the front of the body. The Chumash that came over, the Spanish coming overland, wrote about riding into Chumash villages and being greeted by dancers in full feathered costumes and capes, ceremonial wear for festivals and other kinds of ceremonies. So we can tell stories about what the figures mean. Those stories can be informed, but we didn't paint them, we weren't there. They take them as stories when I tell you what something means, and I may or may not be on the right track in that. And years ago, I was at a planning meeting for a petroglyph national monument in the eastern Pueblo area in New Mexico. And we had a ritual specialist there from 5 of the Pueblos. And he said, listening to us talk about rock art, he says, you know, sometimes I hear what you say and I think, you're right. And that's a really good thing. And sometimes I listen to what you say and I think, you don't know what you're talking about. And that's also a really good thing. So you gotta remember, we're trying to put ourselves inside the head of an artist in another culture. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. So looking at the survival of red, black, and white, this is another figure from the Hurricane Deck area. It's at a place called Pool Rock. The middle photograph is mine from 1982, and the large black and red figure that it appears to be painted over, I'm going to call a bear doctor. It might be something else, but I'm calling it a bear doctor. When Campbell Grant reproduced this particular panel, he didn't show the bird over the chest of the doctor, just the tips of the wings and the feet coming out. And it's always been a question of what did it originally look like? Well, from 1935, we have Snow's photograph of that panel, and we can see the whites were much brighter, the black was heavier, the bird's not there, it's underneath. And so to try to figure out what was going on in this panel, I used that technique de-stretch that I told you about, and that's in the third photograph. From de-stretch, I enhanced the reds, and we can see that the bird was painted first. The geometric figures, the large X's, were painted around the same time. The design at the bottom was painted around the same time. We don't know when the lizard and the net-like design on the left and right were painted in relationship to the large figure because they don't overlap. But you can see sort of how the white has disintegrated between 1935 and 1982. But you can see from the red of the large figure that was the last figure painted over those elements. And my interpretation of this is that it's a deliberate composition, and those elements of the bird, the geometric figures, are significant, powerful elements that lend their power to the what I'm calling the Bear Doctor that's the last to be painted. And I'm not going to go any deeper into that. It would be a long discussion, and there would be a lot of speculation. But that's how I think red, black, and white come together. Here again in the past is Arrowhead Spring. We see that today. It's primarily painted in red. The site is significant. There's a rock overhang here that you can see the underside of it here. It kind of protects the panel, but there's cracks in the rock that allow water to come down, and they form this white calcium deposit that creates that arrowhead-like effect. It just happens to point at the source of a spring that emerges right there that the arrowhead is pointing to. And I can guarantee you, this is one of the times I'll tell you I know that it was important to them. And why do I know that it was important to them? Well, I've zoomed in on the panel, and the very low, the last inset down here, you can see this kind of half human, half fish figure. It's outlined in white, and out of this hand is a line coming with a pinwheel at the end of it, and out of the head is that arrowhead shape that mimics. I don't think that's just happenstance or coincidence. I think that is deliberate. The problem that we have is that it's painted in white. And so Tom, who's here and is a damn good photographer, he's photographed it a couple times in the last couple of years, and that white's basically not there anymore. And so if you just discovered this painting today, you wouldn't know of certain attributes because the white has eroded away in time. Now there are three other colors in the palette. Yellow, and yellow doesn't appear very often, and I have a theory as to why, and I'll explain that in a little bit. This is in McCoy Canyon, which is here in the San Marcos Pass area. That's a bright yellow. The orange or red center is a shade of yellow, and I'll get to that in a minute. Here is a site from the Hurricane Deck area, and I'm going to talk about it more. But there's a trace of yellow in here, so this figure was probably painted in yellow. Iron oxide ranges from yellow to red. At the yellow end of the color, we sometimes call it limonite. If you heat limonite, it turns red because you're driving water out of the molecules. If you look if you've ever been out in the Carrizo Plain and walked across the ground, you'll sometimes see red ochre embedded in the ground. If you dig it out and pick it up and turn it over, it's yellow. The part that's been buried in the ground is yellow. The part that's been exposed to the sun has turned red. Yellow pigment erodes away faster than red pigment, and you might ask, why is that? And I will get to that in a minute. This is another part, something I had to learn for this talk. Here's some other examples of yellow, also at McCoy Canyon. This is yellow down in Anza-Borrego Park, a place called Indian Hill. And bringing it back to the Chumash, this is a yellow, red, white, and black sun figure or mandala figure up here in San Marcos Pass. The other two colors, which are extremely rare, are green and blue. And these appear in a site in the San Emigdio Mountains called Plato Creek. Three researchers here from Santa Barbara, Rick Berry, Antoinette Padgett, and Dan Reeves, tried to reproduce these colors. And there was some indication that the green might be fuchsite, because fuchsite is a rock that's found in Chumash burials in the Ventura County area, and fuchsite outcrops in the San Miguel Mountains. The group that I just mentioned found an area where malachite and azurite was being mined. And azurite is a blue form, and as it breaks down, it becomes green malachite. So they're related rocks. It's not unusual to find them together. But when the green pigment, and there's two shades of green in this picture, when that was tested, it proved to be Saladonite. I'm terrible at words. Basically, what it means, it's a stone that's found in the San Miguel area. You can pronounce it for yourself. Translation of that, it's green stone. And that's where the green comes from. And if you look carefully at the orange, you'll see yellow in it. This is a yellow pigment that's more in the orange range. What was most interesting was the blue. And David Scott talks about optical blue. And what is optical blue? Optical blue is a blend of white and black pigments to form a gray. And it's not just taking a white and a black. It has to be ground to the right grain size so that it mixes properly and forms a light gray. And against a yellow or red color, it appears to us to be blue. How did we know that that's what it is? Another archaeologist working with him by the name of David Robinson brought over somebody with a portable X-ray diffraction gun, and they actually took readings of it and found out what was composed of pigment without having to take samples. What was most interesting in doing that study is that there's black and red figures in here. They may not look red, but they don't look red to me. They probably look red to you. Anyway, in taking readings on all of those, all of the red figures are different compositions of red. So while we're looking at what appears to be a single panel, it was probably created and added to over a period of time, which is interesting in and of itself. Now then, what did I learn producing this talk tonight? This is what was most interesting to me and what I found most valuable from agreeing to give this talk. Tom and I are working on a paper on revisiting the 1935 study of hurricane deck. And we're looking at a site, the rocks in the background. I'm going to move a little closer. This is a boulder outcrop with cupules, those are ground pits, and a mortar on top. And again, we're looking at the far cave. If I come to the other side of that boulder, I'm looking into a shelter that's in a very precarious location. There's a gorge that drops straight off from here with a waterfall. You have to use hand and toe holds to get down into this cave. It's not easy to get into it. There's bedrock mortars, cupules, and a midden in that cave, and I'll show you an inside view in a little bit. But we're interested in right back in this area. And what they found, they called Hematite Cave. And I just want to read their description. The interesting thing about the shelter is the heap of burned stone ranging in size from 1 inch to 5 or 6 inches in diameter. The most of the stones had been burned and were of native sandstone in composition. Intermingling with the stone were pieces of hematite paint, about 75 or 100 pieces of varying shades of red and yellow of varying quality were counted, the best samples of which were kept for study. The whole heap of stones was covered with dirt and fine ash and mixed with very little or no charcoal. I told you from the ethnography they had to roast the hematite to prepare it for grinding. I also told you when you roast limonite or yellow pigment, it turns red. Here's a sample of the ochre that they brought back. You can see here, this is white red. This is black on the outside, but you can see the edges that it's actually a yellow. And if you rub it, you get a nice bright yellow. How did they roast yellow and red pigment without turning the yellow red? In order to give this talk, I had to figure it out, and in the process of figuring out, I learned something about what I was looking at in the back, in the backcountry, and this is why it's so important to follow some of these things through. I told you that limonite, or the yellow ochre, has a water molecule combined with the iron oxide molecule. Maybe I did, maybe I forgot. Anyway, it's yellow because it has this water molecule bound to the iron oxide. Red doesn't have that water molecule bound to it. And that's what makes the one type of ochre yellow and the other type of ochre red. In order to grind the ochre down to the right grain size, and the grain size for making a pigment, for doing a painting, is critical. And there's a whole science today to make red pigments and so forth from ochres. What David Scott discovered is that the grain size of Chumash pigments is about a quarter larger than what appears today in commercial use. That's really close. And that means that the people who were producing pigment understood what they were doing. So how did they get red and yellow prepared for grinding in the same pit? And if we look at pottery production in the Southwest, if you have an anaerobic environment for firing pottery, anaerobic environment means you don't let any oxygen in during the heating process, the pottery turns black. If you have oxygen in, the pottery turns white. So oxygen is important. And so I think what's happening is they're mixing these hematite in with the stones, with sandstone chunks. They're covering it with dirt, and then they're building the fire on top. That creates an anaerobic environment. That's why those hematite chunks look black on the outside. It's because they were fired in an anaerobic environment. Now, how do you keep the yellow yellow? If you roast the pigment to about 800 degrees, you drive off the water that's holding the clay and hematite together, and it's perfect for grinding. In order to drive that oxygen molecule off the iron oxide in the yellow, you have to get up to about 1200 degrees. So they can mix the two together in an anaerobic environment, keep the temperature low enough that they prepare the hematite for grinding without changing the yellow to red. That implies pretty sophisticated technology and knowledge of what's going on. And I think you start putting this together, and we look at the cave that I was pointing out. I'm not going to go into a full description of the cave, but there's a lot of chunks of hematite and pigment in this cave, and the paintings that are on the wall are somewhat different from the rest of the paintings. And as I said, there's some yellow in there that's gone. I think what was happening in this cave is that they were producing pigments in a manufacturing process. And there's more that I'm not going to go into for a lot of reasons. I think that there's also some evidence that you can say that it was women who were producing pigments as opposed to men, but that's a much longer argument. And we know that they were producing pigments, making pigment cakes for both trade and to transfer move the pigment from one area to the other. And these are two pigment cakes that are you can go see in Chumash Hall at the Natural History Museum. They are from the backcountry, and you can see this has been formed and shaped and been molded, and it was a valuable trade item. So what I learned in preparing for this talk here I learned a lot more about the Chumash and their technology than I would have suspected just on, well, you get red hematite, grind it up, and you paint it on the wall. That's not the way that it works. And I want to end with just a plea that humans are the greatest threat to the rock art that survives out there. Some of it erodes away. This is the Carrizo Plain, a place called Painted Rock. Painted Rock is a really spectacular site. It almost looks like a vulva, the Earth's vulva. Inside is a wall that was filled with just incredible paintings. Here's a photograph from 1895. It's in black and white, but these colors are black, white, and red in this site. Here's my photograph from 1984. And almost all of that destruction was done in the early 1900s. Some of it by visitors to the site. A lot of it was done by people who were out there doing oil exploration. If I put those two together, you can see what survives versus what's lost. Again, the site on the left is almost gone, eroded away, and just like the others. But what about the natural processes? This red, black, and white concentric set of circles is right here. And you can see the white has deteriorated some since 1895 to 1984. But here you have water that flows down in the wet season and is helping erode and wash away the painting. Where the water's not running, the painting has survived pretty well. And so, left to their own, most of these sites will survive a long time. Some are in bad environments and disappear. But we can still learn from Painted Rock despite all of the destruction. This is Georgia Lee, who's no longer with us, recording at Painted Rock. And we're going to zoom in on this area. I happened to give a lecture back in the 80s at UC Santa Barbara to an environmental studies class about protecting rock art. And I said, whoever William Hamilton was in 1900, it's what case where I might use kneecapping. I learned not to say that anymore because it turns out his grandson was in the audience and took exception to that. And so, but I tried to get him to come and talk to me so I could learn more about his father and what he was doing in the Carrizo, but he would have nothing to do with me because I disparaged his grandfather for helping destroy this rock art site. And there's a name here, Brumley. Brumley here, the Brumley family was the very first family to live in the Carrizo Plain. Their house was not too far away. It still survives out there today. And as a young girl, she would come out and draw the paintings, but she did carve her name in it. But we've speculated over time as sometimes we know people painted new paintings over old paintings. Other times we speculated that paintings were retouched and refreshed. And because of the damage, I'm going to come right in on that area. And we have very clear evidence that they were in fact refreshing this painting. There's 3 shades of red in different layers there, and because of the damage, we can see that. We don't have to take samples, we don't have to cut into the paintings, we've got the evidence right there in front of us. So there's still value in studying these places. And with that, I want to end on a more positive note instead of things that have been vandalized. The figure on the left is up here in San Marcos Pass. The figure on the right is out in the Carrizo Plain in a very protected shelter, and these are wonderful examples of Chumash rock art and the use of natural pigments on the earth. And with that, I thank you, and I thank these people for contributing to my work, and my wife for letting me come down here and do this. So any questions?
I've explored a lot of the caves around here for the last 35 years. My experience has been that the ones that are easy to get to, like the wind caves off San Marcos Pass, in that period have just had severe deterioration, and then the farther in the backcountry you go, the more better shape they're in. But would that be reasonable to assume that the ones like at San Emilio that are on private property are in better shape than ones on private property just because there's less access?
Let's exclude human impacts for the moment. What the rock art was always described as being done by shamans who would go into the mountains to paint, and they're away from the people. Today, with archaeological studies, we know that, and this is not a scientific number, I'm just going to say 90% of the rock art sites are at activity sites, seasonal activity sites, so they're not hidden away from people. There are exceptions to that, but most of them are. So here in the San Marcos Pass, I wanted to answer that question. Why are they up low and not, why are they up high and not down low? There's different strata of sandstone, and there are archaeological shelters in the San Marcos Pass that are below the cold water sandstone. And those that have midden and so forth in them, the sandstone is very friable. There's no evidence that there was ever any paintings in them, but there is so much fine sand that is eroded off the wall that if they were painted, it's now gone. And so I think part of it is a product of the type of rock that they're painted on as to how well they survive. Now you get up to the wind caves and you have exposure to wind, and wind can do a lot of damage. If you go up to a painted cave, you'll see a large panel of paintings, a gap, and then more paintings. That gap represents the impact of the wind coming down the canyon. So the paintings that were right in the direct impact of that wind are gone. Those that are slightly protected from it are still there. And so I think you have those two things that are happening. The other thing that I've noticed further in the backcountry is that you'll have one site where everything is intact and looks like it was done yesterday, and at the other site there's just fractions of paintings that are left. And I think what's happening there is that the paint helps harden the surface and protect it from erosion. But if the rock is porous and has a lot of water coming into it, the sandstone kind of rots and degrades behind and then falls off in chunks. And so you'll have a part of the wall that you can just run your fingers down and sand will come off, by the fistful. It's so soft. And then there's a little fragment of paint, and that's absolutely hard and still intact. And then, so there's several processes that explain to that. Not having human impact. So in San Emilio, that has been closed to people for so long, you don't have a lot of graffiti and vandalism and impact. And Rick's no longer with us, but his wife is here and she's been through all of that. Can you think of major instances of graffiti when Rick was working in the San Emilio area? Yeah, virtually no human impact, and that makes a big difference. Part of the reason that the Cinnabar Museum of Natural History went back into Hurricane Deck into 1935 is the CCC was starting to build a road. It was going to go down to Naira Camp and up around the end, be the east end of Hurricane Deck and on to Big Pine Mountain. That was abandoned, but that road brought people in that otherwise wouldn't have been into that area. They noticed the paintings and they started taking baskets and stuff out of those cache caves. And that led to the expedition as an emergency expedition to try to figure out what was there, get some cataloging of it, and try to capture the archaeological, the artifacts that the Chumash left. And the Chumash weren't living very far away, they just weren't going back into their gathering anymore. And the museum wanted to capture those artifacts for the museum collections. They're still in the museum. Some of them are on display in Chumash Hall. And so they were preserved both for the future, and the Chumash still have connection to those areas. And the fact that that stuff is preserved instead of gone in somebody's private collection down in LA or whatever keeps them here at home where they belong. And now it's something that we can study and learn from. I don't know if that answered your question, but yes.
Other than their fingers, do you have much information on their brushes?
There are a number of things that we think were used as brushes, and John, I think you have some examples on display in Chumash Hall, or at least reproductions. They may have used like animal tails, a variety of plants that you could fray and use as a brush. I'm just trying to recall from ethnographic records that I've seen. There is a 5-volume set on the material culture of the Chumash. It's by Travis Hudson, who's no longer with us, and Thomas Blackburn. You can get copies at the Natural History Museum, and there is a section on paint and technologies and what Travis and Tom were aware of in the ethnographies at the time. That's recorded in there, and archaeological examples are pictured if they exist. And that's, if I were at home, that's what I would pull that volume off the shelf and I would answer your question directly. Other questions?
The iron oxide that we use in ceramics today is really a rust color.
Yes.
I'd love to be able to get that red. So I was so surprised that we're saying red in it. I know you don't see red, but it's really red.
And in its natural state, that iron oxide is more the rust color. That's and for firing well, I know from friends up in Santa Cruz, which is where I live, from glassmakers up there, red is the most, bright red is the most difficult color to produce in glass. And one of my friends, who again is now gone from ALS, managed to do that, and he was quite proud of the fact that he managed to do that. And you've just walked to the edge of my knowledge of pigments and iron oxides.
I know that when I rinse my hands, they're red.
Yeah.
You know, but I just painted some on raw that'll be fired soon, and it was very rust.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's curious.
Bill, we also have Cinnabar. You know, along the San Ynez River, there were quicksilver mines in,
Right.
in the late 19th into the 20th century. And is there any evidence of Chumash Indians using Cinnabar?
There's no evidence in David Scott's testing, but in the ethnography, Cinnabar was used as a body paint. And that's problematic because of the mercury that's in Cinnabar. Cinnabar is a red mineral, and I've got a huge hunk at home that a friend who was doing an excavation dug into, digging down to where they were going to be doing the excavation, dug through a huge vein of Cinnabar, and so he brought me a large red chunk. But Cinnabar is what they roast to extract the mercury from. So the Chumash did use it as body paint. There's ethnography that they used it as body paint. There's ethnography that they were mining it up where the quicksilver mines that happen in the backcountry. There's also, I think I read one reference that that some chose to stay away from it. Now, I don't think they would have known specifically about the risk of mercury poisoning, but if anybody had an effect from using Cinnabar as body paint, they would have known it, and that would have entered into their practices and their knowledge base. Do you have anything to add to that, Kathy? Other questions? Thank you.